In today's show, I am talking to Dr. Mitchell J. Nathan, Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Learning Sciences in the Educational Psychology Department, Director of the Magic Lab, and a Fellow of the Teaching Academy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He studies how people think, teach, and learn, with special focus on the role that language and embodied processes play in understanding mathematics and engineering disciplines. His research explores the development of algebraic reasoning, expert blind spot in teaching, how cohesion processes support integrated STEM education, computer animation to support the reading of mathematics story problems, and the embodied nature of mathematical intuition and geometric proof, with implications for the design of educational technology, teacher education and professional development, and student knowledge assessment. Professor Nathan has authored over 200 peer-reviewed publications and has recently published a book, Foundations of Embodied Learning, A Paradigm for Education, which is the focus of this show. In his book, he advocates for a coherent evidence-based framework for how people learn. Starting with basic definitions of learning and the current state of the U.S. education system, we address the central role that embodied learning plays in education and how can such an approach be measured. In the second part of the show, we tackle issues related to the role of immersive technologies in reshaping learning and how it might be done. We wrap up with a discussion touching on the important concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion and their relation to an embodied approach to learning. Here is the show. Hello, Mitch. It is nice to have you on the show.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to talking.
Yes, welcome. So let's start with the main question, which is, what are the current learning teaching practices, the American education system, and what should we change?
It's a really great question. I just want to say that it's a really, really large question, right? And I don't want to minimize in presenting my own work that there are so many complexities that come into understanding education, understanding how it functions, understanding what its limitations are, and how those limitations even change, over time. I really want to draw listeners' attention to one particular element of education and the ways that educational practices could be doing more to foster meaning making on the part of learners. And so that is one of the places where I see education as having some serious limitations. And I think we could be doing a lot better based on the research we have. Meaning, as you know, as a linguist, is at the heart of how we understand things and why we engage with things and why we communicate with one another. And so much of education seems to kind of neglect this idea that all of our students are really fundamentally driven to make meaning of the experiences they have. And sometimes that's why students make sometimes errors. They're doing things that are meaningful to them, but they don't follow the rules of some, say, formal system, like a math system or a science system that the teachers are trying to impart. So, if I was going to say what current practices are in place that we could be improving on, it's drawing teachers' attention more to the role of meaning making, bringing more attention to that for curriculum developers and for school leaders.
You have a new book, Foundations of Embodied Learning, where you introduce and describe what you call a coherent evidence-based framework for how people actually learn. There have been now many theories and books written on the subject. How do you approach the problem differently? And probably it would be good to start with, how do you define learning?
Right. I do define learning as an enduring change in behavior. And I point out, as what I think is one of the main contributions of this book, that learning takes place across a wide range of timescales. And I think that is really important to acknowledge, that we use this one term, learning, to describe the ways we have enduring changes of behavior across this vast range of behaviors. So at the very fastest end, the shortest time cycles, we have biological systems that are changing from our experiences through their neural connections. We also engage in pattern matching and pattern generalization, and we do these things very rapidly. And then we have what might be considered more fine-grained cognitive kinds of processes. If you think of things like attention and working memory, these happen on the order of seconds, whereas biological processes are happening on the order of milliseconds. So at the cognitive level, where we have processes that are going on the order of seconds, we have very rapid kinds of processes, but we can pay attention to those processes. We're aware of them, and we can even direct them to some extent. Then as we engage with more complex kinds of tasks, and when we engage in more complex kinds of social structures, like when we're collaborating with other people, we're engaged in conversation, we're doing group projects, then we have more social and sociocultural level processes that come online. And these take place on the order of, even hundreds of seconds, thousands of seconds. So we're talking like days and months. And then we can even engage in learning and changes in behavior at more organizational and institutional levels, where those changes take place over years, sometimes decades, even longer. What becomes very interesting, again, I think as a contribution of this work to think about the nature of learning and the embodied qualities of learning, is that those processes that happen kind of in the middle of that time scale, where they're happening on the order of seconds and minutes, we're able to be quite conscious of those processes. Those really rapid processes happen below our awareness, below our consciousness, and we aren't as able to control or direct those processes. Yet we are doing a large amounts of learning. And as you know, as a linguist, a lot of our primary language learning happens in that vein. It happens in ways where people do not know that they're learning. They don't realize they're following principles of syntax or obtaining a kind of a sensitivity and awareness to some generalized linguistic structures. It just happens through the process of all the exposure we have to language. And also on the farthest end, where processes are extremely slow and they occur over the course of years or decades, we also tend to not be conscious of those. They're too gradual, and so we don't notice the kinds of changes that happen with those. And we don't have as easy system for controlling those things. But learning also is happening in those ways. So where I want to draw attention is to educational practitioners and educational leaders, that there's a lot of attention in schools paid to the conscious spectrum of learning that happens in the middle of the time scale, but very little attention paid to those unconscious processes, and we need to pay more attention to those.
You mentioned linguistics and how do we connect with the world through language. So let's move the discussion now to some of the foundational theories that have been at the core of educational system in the US and in other parts of the world, such as information processing theory, the one that you give importance in your book as well. What is this theory? What does it do well? And what are some of these disadvantages?
Well, information processing theory is one of the dominant paradigms we have for describing intellectual behavior, and it really established its early presence in the mid-50s, 1950s, and it was essentially a product of the realization that prior paradigm, behaviorism, was inadequate in understanding some important qualities of human behavior, particularly human mental behavior. Behaviorism focused on those observable behaviors that one could have and the associations we could make through, say, feedback or other kinds of responses like rewards and punishment. What it lacked, though, was a sense that there were internal mental structures that could not be directly observed and perhaps never be directly observed, but they still mediated our behavior. So a really good example, again, is thinking about language. Children are immersed in the world of language, and they are even able to create novel linguistic utterances, new sentences that they've never heard before, because they can apprehend underlying structure and form new utterances that follow the rules of that structure. Now, sometimes they'll make mistakes. They'll say, I brung the dog to my friend instead of brought, because that's an unusual form of a verb. They will, however, demonstrate that they are picking up on these processes and these patterns by making these errors, as well as making correct kinds of inferences about language. Information processing is very effective and powerful at describing this kind of symbolic level thinking. And what it has done in service of its own theorizing is create learning experiences that emphasize the symbolic, but tend to neglect those things that fall outside of the symbolic kinds of thinking. So we tend to, for example, emphasize the role of, say, formal symbols and notations in mathematics. And we want students to gain familiarity with using those symbols, like using arithmetic and using algebra. And so we end up with this kind of self-reinforcing approach where we have a paradigm that describes a certain kind of reasoning as this computing of symbols happening inside the mind. We create tasks that emphasize that very kind of symbolic behavior. And then we show that our models are very effective at describing those behaviors, even successful and unsuccessful. So think of a case, for example, where a child is learning how to do column arithmetic. And in column arithmetic, you have these digits that you line up vertically, right? And let's say you're subtracting 7 from 10. Put the 10 and on top, and you put the 7 below, and you line the 7 up with the 0 of the 10. And a child then very logically says that they have a rule that 0 means nothing. So 0 means nothing. And so you can't take 7 from 0, right? So you end up either deciding that 7 from 0 must be either 7, because you can't take away, or you decided 0, both of which are incorrect, but both of which follow a logical pattern of rules of manipulating symbols. So then when we see an error, like a child says, the answer is 7 or the answer is 17 or something like that, we can scratch our heads and say, boy, this kid really doesn't understand the math. But in fact, this child is trying to make meaning out of a rule-based system that is using arbitrary symbols to convey kind of relationships. And children would never make the same mistake if you gave them physical objects, like 10 objects, and took 7 of them away. They would never say it was 17 or something like that. So we have this contrast, which is that we have this physical world that is not entirely symbolic. It is rich with physical actions, it's rich with objects, it's rich with social interactions. And these are not all captured in the information processing view of mind. So the embodied cognition perspective and views of embodied learning that acknowledge that learning and thinking uses a variety of our sensory motor systems and our social systems and our interactions with the environment and the world that we operate in, they allow for different kinds of descriptions of thought and learning that go far beyond what the symbolic principles of information processing can afford. So a really good example of this, which I describe under the heading of formalisms first, is when, for example, in mathematics, we want children to understand how to solve not just math problems that are written as computational number sentences or algebraic sentences, but as story problems, right? We want people to be able to apply the mathematics they have to things that might happen in the real world, like how long it might take to get from one place to another at a specific speed. But we do something very peculiar, something that I think is evidence that we're caught in this information processing framework at the cost of student learning. We say to ourselves, well, you could write this equation you could write this mathematical relationship as an equation, or you could write this mathematical relationship as a system of words or symbols. What educators decide is, well, the symbols are simpler. They're pure. They're more straightforward. They don't have the same kind of ambiguity that words have, and words are more complex, and there's all sorts of reading that has to happen in terms of the words. You have to engage in reading comprehension, understand the story, understand the structure. And so educators will position symbol mastery ahead of any opportunities to do story problems. And when we ask teachers, and we've done this now empirically in a number of studies, to take a whole set of problems that include equations and that include story problems, and order them from what children will find easiest to what children will find most difficult, they almost always put the symbol problems as easiest, and they almost always put the story problems as most difficult. And they also provide a rationale. They have kind of like a theory of mind, and their theory is that, in fact, language is harder and symbols are more straightforward. When we actually have the empirical evidence from students doing these problems, we find that the story problems are solved at a much higher rate of success than the symbol problems. And the reason is the following. The story problems make sense to the readers. They make sense to these students. They can understand what it means to move through space. They can understand if a waiter is working for a certain number of hours, they're going to earn more money than if they work for fewer hours. They understand, for example, if a waiter also makes tips, how to add the value of tips to the amount that person makes, even though they're working for a certain number of hours. They understand how to use a coupon, and they understand whether the coupon should be added or subtracted from the total value of an item that you're buying in the supermarket. They don't make the same kind of mistakes that they make with symbols. With symbols, they make really kind of silly mistakes. They will take the number of hours and they'll add it to the tips. They will get very confused about whether a coupon should be added or subtracted. When they try to work in this symbolic space, they see these arbitrary symbols and they try to make sense of them by applying the rules as best they can. But when they have the same mathematics in a story form, they understand stories. For example, they understand they can run a story backwards and that all the events will be undone. And they understand that the operations of undoing those things can happen. If you added something, then you would take it away. If you multiplied something, then you would divide it. So we have this huge contradiction where children can solve story problems in a much higher rate and have much greater success, and the problems are much more meaningful to them than symbol equations are. But educators think the opposite. And this is one of the outcomes of a system of education that's rooted in an information processing framework.
You mentioned language and these logic representations for algebraic calculus and others. In fact, there is an old joke in linguistic circles a long time ago. The semanticist Barbara Partee mentioned this joke. So imagine that there is a formal semanticist who is asked the question, what is the meaning of life? And the semanticist answers, life with uppercase letters to really represent the predicate life, which is used to capture meaning in first order period calculus. So there are clear limitations of this approach. And I do believe that many communities are moving away from this. So this idea of embodied cognition and immersive experience, these ideas are very popular. And we're going to see more research on this. But let's move to your proposal, right? So what you propose as a solution to this problem is what you call the grounded and embodied learning thesis. Would you summarize in a few words, what exactly is the core of this thesis?
So the core of the grounded and embodied learning thesis is that it is necessary for learning experiences to engage our body-based processes in order for learning and instruction to be meaningful. So by thinking about body-based processes, I mean this in actually a very broad sense. So obviously, one of those senses is movement and our perceptual abilities our body forms. These are really obvious and central to body-based processes. I also include things like gesture, how we move our hands and arms and facial expressions when we communicate, and how we do this to be understood by others, and how we also do it in order to help ourselves think. We will invoke gestures frequently when we are puzzled, when we're straining to find the right kinds of language, when we are speaking with others for whom we feel like we need to speak very carefully, certainly when we're responding to others' confusion, we will invoke this more body-based form of communication. But I also mean that our body-based resources include a very powerful mechanism that we seem to have developed evolutionarily, which is the ability to simulate, the ability to imagine and simulate things. So what do I mean by simulate? Well, certainly when I go through my house and let's say I'm doing some home repair and I need to remove a bolt from some part of an object, there's always this moment of puzzle whether I should turn my wrist clockwise or counterclockwise, right? Or when I'm removing a light bulb, whether I should turn it one way or the other. And then it gets even more confusing if the light bulb is on the wall or on the ceiling, or because I keep changing my plane of orientation. I can obviously physically do that. And if I get it wrong, the world gives me feedback. It's like, I want to make it loose and it's making it tighter. I can feel that, right? So we would describe that in the psychology of embodied cognition as online cognition. Cognition that's happening while I'm engaged in the task, while I'm literally in the context in which I need to use that thinking. I also can simulate the same perceptual motor processes when I'm engaged in offline cognition. When I'm on the phone explaining to somebody how to remove a bolt or how to change a light bulb, I can engage those same systems. Now, I may gesture at that time. I may, for example, be like, let me think about it. Oh, yeah, you have to turn it clockwise, or you have to turn it to the right, or to remove it, we have to go counterclockwise or to the left. I may have to do that to help my simulation, but I can imagine doing that even when I'm not in the situation. And when I do that, scholars have found I am literally activating the same sensory motor systems in my mind, even when I'm not in the situation, as I did when I was actually in that physical situation. So simulation is a really important part of our ability to carry forth complex and versatile thinking by virtue of our embodied and body-based resources.
Yeah, so in our interaction with the world, and this also includes communication, interaction with other people, we know that we integrate multiple sensors and effector modalities. You mentioned auditory speech, gestural actions, body posture, movement, and others. But you also mentioned this sensorial cluster or category. What role do you think the senses, and not necessarily the five senses only, sight, hearing, touch, smell, taste, and so on. What do you think their role and their interconnections play in this grounded and embodied learning approach?
Yeah, it's a really great question and a really sophisticated kind of arena of research, because we know we have a range of sensations and perceptual systems. And you're right to call out, there's more than the classic five senses that we often emphasize in early education, because we have things like interoception. And that's a really great one, because when we engage in body movement, we also have to have some prediction of where our bodies are going to end up in the course of that movement and what the final outcome will be as a result of our movement. So one of the examples I really like is the case of picking up a tea kettle. Imagine you walk up to a tea kettle, and now you start to appreciate, as I described this anecdote, that our sensation and perception and motor system don't operate in a vacuum. They also operate in the context of our beliefs and expectations about the world. So I may believe, for example, that the tea kettle is full. And I go and I pick up that tea kettle and I exert all certain very specific kinds of motor programming in order that my shoulder and elbow and wrists and parts of my hand all coordinate in order to grasp the handle and lift up the tea kettle with the appropriate amount of force with the expectation that it's full. Now, much to my surprise in this scenario, the tea kettle is empty. And I think some of us have had this experience where essentially for a moment, the tea kettle flies off the table. We almost can imagine ourselves as an observer watching this very comical thing. We've overestimated the weight of the tea kettle and we've exerted too much force. The proper amount of force if it had water, but the incorrect amount of force with it empty. And so now we have to engage in a lot of correction of our behavior. Otherwise, this thing's going to fly out of our hands, perhaps hit something or someone. This is a bad state of affairs, right? And it's only, a very minor example. We have a system in place to help us manage all this that I think is extraordinary. We do not merely use feedback as a way to correct our behavior in the world. We have many processes that are engaged in feed forward as well, which is to say they are operating from a predictive stance of how to behave in the world. And in fact, we need this predictive orientation toward the world because it allows us to be very responsive. And the truth is, for the most part, the world is highly predictive. So our sensors and our motor system are often in this anticipatory state of what we think we're going to encounter. We then do get feedback as to whether our expectations are accurate or not, and we make those kind of corrections. One of the things I offer in this book, drawing on research from many others, is the idea that this predictive orientation is another way that we simulate the world, another way that we imagine what the state of the world is and what it could be. And it readies us for the opportunity to constantly update our model of what our environment will be like and what will be expected of us. We don't want to be in the position of only reacting. It's too slow. And we would have, certainly at earlier times in our existence, but even in modern day, put ourselves at grave risk if we only had a feedback system that waited to react to our thinking.
Yes, so moving from this old theory that looks at the brain as a computational machinery that manipulates symbols and operations on symbols, to this embodied cognition approach where the brain is actually a predictive machinery doing all sorts of other processes in parallel. This is actually a very important shift, and we're going to see this more and more, not only in cognitive science and psychology. Actually, there has been already 8 embodied cognitive turn in these areas, but also in other areas as well. But let's talk about assessment practices next. You say in your book that embodied learning also demands that we rethink our assessment practices. What's wrong with the current assessment practices of learning and instruction, and how can we assess embodied learning? For instance, you define learning as an enduring changing in behavior. Here, the question is, based on this definition, how do you exactly measure this? Because it seems that it requires thoughtful inquiry, rigorous analysis, and research in behavior. Do we have the instruments, do we have the tools we need to assess embodied learning?
We have some very powerful tools for assessing learning. Educators use instruments that are both quantitative and psychometrically reliable and valid to document one's early and initial state of knowledge and one's later state of knowledge. And you can use that to determine how one has changed. And so that fits the definition of an enduring change in one's behavior, in this case, one's intellectual behavior on a test. So we have systems like that in place that work quantitatively. We have qualitative methods of doing it, which are more likely to involve an interpretive frame of what a person is reporting in an assessment situation, like, for example, in an essay or in an interview or a presentation. And educators may use, for example, rubrics that identify features that they consider to be important and look for the occurrences of those features in their qualitative assessments. Where we seem to be limited is the strong emphasis within those assessment practices on the recording of verbal forms of knowing. So in many of the cases that I described, what we're really doing is we're giving a test, maybe a piece of paper or something online that is rich with words and perhaps also images. And we ask back from our students to report their verbal understanding, for the most part, of these ideas or these skills. However, if you take the proposal seriously, as it sounds as though you do, and it sounds as though the field is embracing more and more, that we have both verbal and nonverbal forms of knowing, then we really start to acknowledge that we are remiss in ways of capturing nonverbal ways of knowing and nonverbal changes in those ways of knowing, which would mean nonverbal forms of learning. So let me give you a couple of examples. One is the case where a student is trying to understand something as complex as a science idea that involves multiple factors that work together, right? So a lot of times in science, we don't just look at a single thing, we look at the interaction of things. So think about something like torque. Like torque is the interaction of two things. You've got some kind of force and it's applied at some kind of distance. Well, it might be more visually salient for a learner early on to appreciate the distance between two things. And they might overemphasize the role of that distance in thinking about torque, or they might overemphasize the role of force or weight in thinking about it. And they don't realize that these things work together to create torque. However, that same student may be able to gesture their understanding of torque in a way that doesn't get captured in a written response or a typed response for an online exam. And they may be out there thinking to themselves, oh, it's the weight, but they're really doing like a lever with a leverage arm that is conveying both distance and weight. If we have a richer system of understanding how to assess students' knowledge, we would be able to incorporate these kinds of forms of nonverbal communication in our assessment instruments. And we would have a much richer account of what people know. So I'll give you another example that comes out of research. We had a project some years ago in my lab where students read a science text about the heart and lung and circulatory system. And then we asked them to respond verbally to a number of questions about this text that they read, which was written at like an upper high school or college level. And what we did was we had some students freely able to talk and gesture. We had other students who had to tap on a table following a metronome while they were responding. And we had two forms of this tapping. One was what I might consider simple tapping, which was kind of mindless. You could just tap, 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 tap in the same spot. And another, people were tapping on a grid that was a 2x2 grid numbered 1, 2, 3, 4. And about every minute, the pattern that they had to tap out would change. So they might have to do 1, 2, 3, 4 initially, and then 2, 3, 4, 1. And they had to keep up that rhythm the whole time. We were curious, because this occupied their motor system, what would be the impact on their performance on the test of this lesson on the circulatory system? And we found that the tapping activity impacted performance significantly, and it did so in a very strange way. For simple kinds of information like verbatim recall of information in the text, for fact retrieval, and for just general knowledge, there was no impact virtually of the tapping compared to the people who were free to speak and gesture. But for higher order questions that involve things like inference making, that involve things like putting two remote pieces of information together, the people who had to do this spatial tapping where the pattern kept changing, their performance on those higher order cognitive questions degraded incredibly compared to the simple tapping group and the group that was free to gesture. And our interpretation of this was that the people who were involved in this more complex spatial tapping task at the same time could not invoke the spatial and motor resources that people would normally use to imagine the causal reasoning and inference making that would go into these higher order questions, whereas even the simple tapping people could do so. Now I'm going to tell you one other thing. We also had another group. That group was the typing group. They were very much like the tapping group. They had to type their answers. And if you think about typing, it's a lot like that spatial tapping task. You have to follow a certain pattern. The pattern doesn't actually help you think about the circulatory system. It just helps you type out the various letters to make the words. It occupies the motor system and the kinds of causal reasoning the same way that spatial tapping activity did. And we saw the same degradation of performance from the typing people as we saw from the spatial tapping group. They performed less on these higher order questions because aspects of their embodied resources were occupied, were unavailable for the kind of thinking they needed to do to answer those higher order questions.
Yeah, very interesting experiments for sure. This actually shows that embodied cognition is really directly applicable to how we learn, not only in physical scenarios, physical environments, but also in virtual ones. So I would like to move now to the topic of educational technology. We are moving toward Web 3.0, these highly immersive reality environments capable of supporting all sorts of embodied phenomena. What do you think the role of technology, this kind of technology, immersive technology, will play in reshaping learning, classroom learning and or instruction, the education system in general? And how do you think this might be done?
Well, this is a really great question and very timely because this is kind of fast-moving train that we're observing, where we are having these new kinds of immersive technology, even head-mounted versions of these systems that may soon be readily available in most homes, readily available in most classrooms. You know, they may start to occupy our learning experiences and our entertainment experiences just as much as we've had laptops and other kinds of digital media. I do believe that this kind of immersive experience has tremendous potential for leading to the kind of embodied learning experiences that could be helpful. We have work going on here at the University of Wisconsin with my colleague Candace Walkington at Southern Methodist University and my colleague here, Michael Swart at Wisconsin, where we are looking at the role of virtual reality and augmented reality for reasoning about mathematics, for reasoning about geometry, which is essentially, thinking about the generalized properties of space and of shapes. And what we're looking for this technology to do is a couple things. One is we want to create the direct access that we could have with these very objects so people could reason about them and invoke their embodied resources the way they would do when they're physically in the world and they're actually manipulating and creating objects. We want to do this in contrast to the learning experience that most students have on geometry, which is the two-column proof, which is, I think you can imagine, very removed from the actual properties of shape and space. It really is more about logical structure and forming declarative statements, often very static statements, coming up with particular formal notations to describe these relationships, and coming up with a logical sequence that leads to their generalization. What we find is that is not as accessible to students' thought, that they are much more comfortable engaged in transformational ways of thinking about shape and space, that they can actually pick up an object and move it, what we see, for example, is people use their hands to do a lot of these kinds of things. They'll use their hands as a resource. They will also use the hands and arms and bodies of their classmate with something that we call collaborative gestures, that they'll mutually co-create these kinds of shapes and forms, and then transform those shapes and forms in ways that allow them to explore these general properties. And by doing that, they are essentially engaged in a much more direct exploration of what properties are true and which properties may hold under very constrained conditions. The new technologies we have now can not only provide this rich sensorial experience of immersion, as in the case of virtual reality, but in the case of augmented reality, you can also do this in a much more collaborative way because you can actually see the other people you're with, and you can see the space that you're actually in to move these things about. So by doing that, you, for example, could observe the gestures of your collaborators while you are planning the kind of movements you want to make, which is a little more complex and looks a little more cartoonish in a virtual reality kind of setting. So there's actually some really nice advantages of augmented reality to this, as well as the virtual reality, which tends to, I think, get a little more press.
Yes, this is still a virgin field, the virgin space, and we're going to see more and more research from all sorts of disciplines on this. So another topic that has been quite popular in this past years, in particular in education, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I really appreciate when people talk about this in very specific scenarios like yours. So an embodied approach to learning has also a direct and important implication to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. How come?
Sure. Well, the first thing I guess I want to point out is that this is a long time coming in education. We've had many educational leaders and policy people and cultural theorists and critical theorists sounding out concerns that an educational system needs to attend to issues of equity and diversity and inclusion, because these have direct impact on children's ability to be present, to have rich learning experiences, and to develop into thoughtful and socially well-adjusted and emotionally well-adjusted members of our society. And when we withhold these things, we are doing ourselves a disservice that we end up, influencing negatively the nature of our society later on. So educational opportunities early on in children's lives have enormous positive influence throughout their lives and throughout society. So we need to attend to those things. And we also know that growing up in poverty and growing up under an oppressive system, growing up with chronic exposure to stress, has an enormous negative impact, not only on learning and not only on things like one's sleep and one's health, but one's long-term intellectual development. So these really need to be things that are considered at the fore of concerns for education. So grounded and embodied learning offers opportunities to make educational experiences more equitable. Some of the ways that it can make them more equitable are, for example, as we talked about, looking at assessments that allow for a much broader way to express one's ways of knowing. So by including things like one's nonverbal communication, by allowing students to collaborate during assessment experiences where they can tap into the shared knowledge and also make use of the rich resources that they might be using in the course of their learning during assessment, is another way to make learning more equitable. I think it's a fine idea in many cases to let students work in teams and have access to the internet during assessment situation, because I want to see what they're going to do with that information. I don't really care as much about one's ability to sort of recall some things, because in most cases, people have ready access to that information they might need to recall. But how we use that information, how we do problem solving, how we design and create things, that's really where we need to be assessing students' knowledge and performance. We also could be looking at ways that teachers could be communicating better to their students. So for example, we talked about the role of gesture, and instructional gestures are really powerful ways to enhance teachers' ability to convey what they know to their students. And in work that I have done now for many years with Martha Ali, who is a child development psychologist, has shown that when we allow teachers to freely gesture during their instruction, they do gesture in very helpful ways to their children. They use gesture in ways that are responsive to the content and are also responsive to the needs of learners. For example, when children exhibit some kind of confusion or some kind of trouble spot, we see teachers increase the rate at which they provide those gestures. And the kinds of gestures they provide are ones that are more oriented toward addressing those trouble spots. By inviting a view of education that acknowledges embodied learners and embodied learning, we actually can create a much more equitable and inclusive environment. And I want to just make one shout out, if I may, to some of my colleagues who've been doing work thinking about this, but Maxine McKinney de Royston, Carol Lee, Naila Nasir, and Roy P. have this wonderful piece that came out very recently in the Phi Delta Kappan called Rethinking Schools, Rethinking Learning, where they offer something called the RISE principles. And what's so interesting about that is they're couching it in this language of equity and inclusion, but the language is very embodied. So let me share with you the RISE principles. The R is that learning is rooted in our bodies and our brains. The I in RISE is that it's integrated with every aspect of human development, including emotion, cognition, and formation of identity. The S in RISE is that learning is shaped through culturally organized activities in everyday life, both in and out of school and across our lifespan. And the E in RISE is that learning is experienced in our bodies and coordinated through social interactions with the world and others. These are all really important progressive ideals for education, and they all point to the embodied nature of how we are in the world and how we think.
Thank you for sharing that research. We are going to make it available to our listeners and viewers as well. So indeed, making sense of the world through personalized, grounded ways of knowing makes a lot of sense. We are at the end of our session here. How can our audience learn more about you, your books, and your research? Where can they find you?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. My book is called Foundations of Embodied Learning, A Paradigm for Education. It's available at the Routledge website, which is a branch of Taylor and Francis. It's also available in many other online avenues of getting books. There is also a website for my research lab at the University of Wisconsin, which is at magiclab.wceruw.org. So, or you could just look for me, Mitchell Nathan, on the web. I'm pretty easy to find. I also have a wonderful network of colleagues who we use the website embodiedmathematics.org. And these are all researchers and educators who look at the role of body and body-based processing for mathematics teaching and learning, and the act of doing mathematics. And on the 30th, I'm going to be doing a live virtual conversation about my book at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. So that's the Chicago time zone. That's going to be hosted by the bookstore A Room of One's Own, which is a locally owned independent bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin. And that will be virtual, so people can join it from wherever they are, but it will be live. So I'll be part of an online live book conversation on November 30th at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. So that's the Chicago time zone, hosted by one of our independently owned local bookstores in Madison, Wisconsin, called A Room of One's Own. Participate in that conversation about the ideas presented in my book.
Yeah, we should advertise.
I can give you a
as
link
well,
for that.
for sure. Yes, I'll be happy to do that. And I'm sure that there are going to be other people there interested in your book. I did personally enjoy the book. I think it really comes at the right time, not only for special circles such as the cognitive science and psychology, but it really, really plugs into so many other areas. Of course, one of interest to this podcast is artificial intelligence, creative technologies. Thank you so much for your time, Mitch. This was great. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you for your thoughtful questions.